The streets of the bustling city were alive with the hum of activity. Cars honked, vendors called out their wares, and the aroma of street food lingered in the air. Amidst the chaos, a young boy named Liam stood on a street corner, his tiny frame dwarfed by the towering skyscrapers around him. His clothes were tattered, his face streaked with dirt, but his eyes held a spark of determination that refused to be extinguished. Clutching a crumpled piece of paper with a doctor's note scribbled on it, Liam looked out at the sea of faces passing him by, each one oblivious to his desperation. Liam's mother, the only family he had, lay gravely ill in a hospital nearby. The doctors had made it clear, without an expensive surgery, she wouldn't survive. But in a world where Liam struggled to scrape together enough for a single meal, the idea of raising such an enormous sum seemed impossible. Yet, he couldn't give up. His mother had always told him that miracles happen to those who believe, and he held on to those words like a lifeline. Liam approached strangers, pleading with them to spare anything they could. "Please, my mom is in the hospital. She needs help," he cried, his voice cracking. Most people avoided his gaze, brushing past him as if he were invisible. A few dropped a coin or two into his trembling hands, but it was nowhere near enough. Hours passed, and the boy's hope began to waver. Just as the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the city, a sleek black limousine pulled up to the curb near where Liam stood. The door opened, and out stepped a man whose presence seemed to command attention. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his watch glinting in the fading light. It was Alexander Sterling, a billionaire known for his business empire and notoriously guarded demeanor. To Liam, however, he was just another person, another chance to save his mother. Summoning every ounce of courage he had left, Liam ran towards the billionaire, nearly tripping over his own feet. "Please, sir," he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. Alexander turned, his piercing blue eyes narrowing as they landed on the scrappy figure before him. "What is it, boy?" he asked, his tone curt but not unkind. Liam held up the crumpled note, his hands trembling. "My mom, she's in the hospital. They said she needs surgery, but I don't have the money. Please, I'll do anything. Just help me save her." His words tumbled out in a rush, tears streaming down his face. For a moment, Alexander simply stared at the boy, his expression unreadable. The world around them seemed to pause, the sounds of the city fading into the background. Would this man, a stranger with unimaginable wealth, hear the plea of a poor, desperate boy? Liam's heart pounded as he waited for an answer, the weight of his mother's life resting on this single moment. Alexander Sterling stared at the boy for a long moment, his sharp features betraying no emotion. Liam's heart sank, fearing that his plea had fallen on deaf ears like so many others. But then, something shifted in Alexander's gaze. A flicker of recognition, perhaps a memory stirred by the boy's earnestness, softened his otherwise steely demeanor. Without a word, Alexander knelt to meet Liam's eyes. "Take me to her," Alexander said simply, his voice low but firm. Liam blinked in disbelief. "Whoa, what?" he stammered, not sure if he had heard correctly. "Your mother," Alexander repeated, standing back up. "Let's go see her. I need to know the truth." Liam's eyes widened with a mixture of relief and confusion. He quickly nodded, leading Alexander down the bustling streets towards the hospital. As they walked, Liam spoke in a torrent, explaining how his mother had always worked hard, cleaning houses and doing odd jobs to support them after his father had passed away. He shared how she had fallen ill suddenly, how he had tried everything, selling their few belongings, begging on the streets, but it hadn't been enough. Alexander listened silently, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. He didn't interrupt, but his expression grew darker with every word. Something about Liam's story touched a part of him he rarely allowed anyone to see. It reminded him of his own childhood struggles, growing up in a poor household with a single mother who had worked herself to the bone for him. When they arrived at the hospital, the sight of it, a run-down building with peeling paint and flickering lights, caught Alexander off guard. He wasn't accustomed to such places. Inside, Liam led him to a small, dimly lit room where his mother lay on a worn-out hospital bed, her face pale and gaunt. Machines beeped faintly, and the air smelled of antiseptic. "Mom," Liam whispered, rushing to her side. Her eyes fluttered open, and she managed a weak smile. "Liam, you came back," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Then her gaze shifted to Alexander, who stood at the foot of the bed, his tall frame casting a shadow across the room. Who is this?" Before Liam could answer, a nurse entered, looking flustered. "Sir, only family is allowed," she began, but Alexander raised a hand, silencing her. "I'm here to help," he said firmly, pulling out his phone. "I need to speak to the attending physician immediately." The nurse hesitated, her eyes flicking between Liam, his mother, and Alexander's commanding presence. Finally, she nodded and hurried out. Moments later, the doctor arrived, his expression wary. Alexander wasted no time. "How much is the surgery she needs?" he asked brusquely. The doctor looked startled, but answered, "It's a complex procedure, and without insurance, it's around $150,000. Liam's breath hitched. To him, the amount sounded like an impossible fortune. But Alexander didn't flinch. Instead, he turned to the doctor and said, "Schedule it immediately. I'll cover the cost." Liam gasped, his eyes filling with tears. You mean it?" he asked, hardly daring to believe. Alexander nodded, his face serious. "Yes, but this is only the beginning," he added cryptically. As the staff scrambled to make arrangements, Liam clung to his mother's hand, overwhelmed with gratitude. But in the back of his mind, he wondered, why would a man like Alexander go out of his way for strangers? What had driven him to act so decisively? The answer, as they would soon learn, was far more personal than they could have imagined. While the hospital staff prepared for the surgery, Alexander stayed by Liam's side. His usual aloof demeanor began to fade, replaced by a quiet warmth that surprised even himself. Liam couldn't stop thanking him, but Alexander remained enigmatic about his reasons for helping. As the hours ticked by, Liam's mother, Sarah, managed to whisper her gratitude. "I don't know why you're doing this, but thank you," she said weakly, her voice trembling. Alexander offered her a small, rare smile. "Sometimes, life gives us a chance to repay debts we thought we never could," he replied cryptically. It wasn't long before Sarah was wheeled into surgery. As the doors to the operating room closed, Liam sat in the waiting area, his small hands clenched together in a silent prayer. Alexander sat beside him, the usually composed billionaire looking uncharacteristically tense. "You remind me of myself, you know," Alexander said after a long silence, his voice low and reflective. Liam glanced up, confused. "What do you mean?" Alexander hesitated, his gaze distant, as if he was looking into a past he rarely revisited. "I wasn't always a billionaire," he admitted. "I grew up poor. My mother worked herself to exhaustion just like yours. I lost her because we couldn't afford the care she needed." His voice faltered, the raw emotion surprising even him. Liam stared, wide-eyed. He had never imagined someone like Alexander, with his tailored suits and powerful presence, could understand what it meant to struggle. "When I saw you on that street," Alexander continued, "I saw myself. I saw a boy desperate to save the only person who had ever truly loved him. I couldn't walk away." Liam's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," he said again, his voice choked with emotion, "for helping my mom, and for understanding." The sincerity in Liam's words touched Alexander deeply. In that moment, he realized that his wealth meant nothing if it couldn't be used to make a real difference. This wasn't just about charity, it was about redemption. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Finally, the surgeon emerged, his expression tired but pleased. "The surgery was a success," he announced. "She's stable and recovering." Liam jumped up, tears streaming down his face. Thank you so much." The surgeon smiled, but his gaze shifted to Alexander. "It's rare to see someone step in like this. You saved her life." Alexander simply nodded, his stoic demeanor returning. But deep down, he felt a sense of relief and fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. As Sarah was moved to a recovery room, Alexander stayed in the background, watching as Liam hugged his mother tightly. The bond between them reminded him of his own mother and the sacrifices she had made for him. For the first time in a long time, he felt connected to something greater than himself. But the story wasn't over yet. Alexander had one more surprise in store for Liam and Sarah, something that would ensure they'd never have to face such hardship again. The following morning, Sarah awoke in her hospital bed, her body still weak, but her spirit uplifted by the sight of Liam sleeping in a chair next to her. Her son had refused to leave her side, his tiny hand still holding hers protectively. The hospital room was quiet, the beeping of monitors the only sound. When Alexander walked in, his presence filled the room. He carried an air of quiet determination, the kind that commanded attention without the need for words. Liam sprang to his feet, his face lighting up. "Mr. Alexander, Mom's awake," he exclaimed, running to him. Alexander knelt down, resting a hand on Liam's shoulder. "I'm glad to see her doing better," he said softly, his gaze shifting to Sarah. Sarah looked at Alexander with gratitude. "I owe you my life," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't even know how to begin thanking you." "You don't owe me anything," Alexander replied firmly. "But there's something I need to say." He straightened, pulling an envelope from his coat pocket. He handed it to Sarah, who looked at it hesitantly before opening it. Inside were legal documents and a check that made her breath catch in her throat. "This is..." Sarah's voice faltered. "This is too much." "It's not," Alexander said simply. "The documents transfer ownership of a home in a safe neighborhood to you, fully paid for, and the check is to cover Liam's education and your recovery." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. "I can't accept this. It's too generous." "You can and you will," Alexander said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Liam's courage reminded me of what's truly important in life. You've raised a son who's brave, selfless, and kind. The least I can do is ensure that both of you have a chance to build a future without the constant weight of struggle." Liam looked up at Alexander, his eyes wide. "Does this mean we don't have to worry anymore?" he asked, his voice filled with hope. Alexander knelt again, looking directly into Liam's eyes. "It means you and your mom can focus on being happy and healthy, and maybe one day you can pay it forward to someone else." Sarah's tears flowed freely as she clutched the envelope to her chest. "You're an angel," she whispered. "I don't know what we did to deserve this." Alexander's expression softened. "You reminded me of where I came from, and the promises I made to myself when I was in your position. This is me keeping those promises." Before leaving, Alexander gave Liam a final pat on the shoulder. "Take care of your mom," he said. "She's a fighter, just like you." As he walked out of the hospital room, Alexander felt a weight lift from his heart. For the first time in years, his wealth had been used for something meaningful. It wasn't about charity or publicity, it was about humanity. Inside the hospital room, Sarah held Liam close, tears of joy streaming down her face. The envelope in her lap wasn't just a lifeline, it was a symbol of hope and a reminder that kindness could come from the most unexpected places. As they left the hospital days later, Sarah and Liam stepped into a new chapter of their lives, one filled with promise and possibility. And though they wouldn't see Alexander again, they would always remember the man who had stepped into their darkest hour and given them a light to follow. Meanwhile, Alexander returned to his towering office building, but his perspective had shifted. His experience with Liam and Sarah reignited a sense of purpose he thought he had lost. And while he continued to build his empire, he never forgot the little boy who had taught him that true wealth lay in the hearts we touch, not the fortunes we amass.